The Melungeons were never a single people with a single origin story, and the deeper scientists look into their DNA, the harder it becomes to explain them with one simple answer. This is not simply a story about a mysterious population hidden in the Appalachian Mountains. It is a story about ancestry. It is a story about migration. It is a story about race, identity, memory, and survival. And most importantly, it is a story about what happens when the categories humans create are far simpler than the people those categories are supposed to describe. For generations, the Melungeons have been described as one of America's great mysteries. Their story is deeply connected to the mountains of eastern Tennessee, particularly Hancock and Hawkins counties, as well as surrounding areas of Virginia and other parts of Appalachia. But the name Melungeon itself has a complicated history. The term appeared in 19th century records and was generally used by outsiders to describe people whose ancestry did not seem to fit neatly into the racial categories of the time. Some were described as white, others appeared in records under classifications such as free person of color or mulatto, and family traditions sometimes connected ancestors to Native American, Portuguese, African, or other backgrounds. That inconsistency created a mystery, but it also created something more dangerous: stigma. For much of American history, race was not simply a description. It could determine where you lived, who you could marry, what property you could own, how authorities classified your children, and how your neighbors treated you. So when a population did not fit neatly into the categories of white, black, or Native American, the problem was not always that the people themselves were mysterious. Sometimes the problem was that society had created categories that could not contain them. The Melungeon story began attracting serious scholarly attention in the 20th century. One of the most important studies came from cultural geographer Edward Price. In 1950, Price completed his dissertation on mixed blood populations of the eastern United States, using census records and archival evidence to investigate groups that had been classified in different ways. According to the Tennessee Encyclopedia, Price concluded that the Melungeons of eastern Tennessee were descended in significant part from free people of color who moved into the area from the Virginia and North Carolina Piedmont during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. He also concluded that descendants of European and free black unions had intermarried with people of Native American ancestry. That explanation became one of the foundations of the mainstream historical interpretation, and it is important to understand what this theory actually says. It does not say the Melungeons were simply a mysterious tribe that appeared in Appalachia. It says their history was created through migration and intermarriage. Families moved, families married, children were born, and over generations, different ancestral populations became connected. There is nothing unusual about mixture itself. What was unusual was the way these particular families were perceived and classified. And yet, the mainstream explanation did not completely satisfy everyone, because long before DNA testing existed, there were stories about the Melungeons that seemed to point somewhere much farther away. Some traditions claimed Portuguese ancestry, others suggested Spanish origins. Some writers proposed Mediterranean or Middle Eastern connections. There were theories involving Moors, Turks, Jews, Roma, and even ancient peoples from the Mediterranean world. Some stories became so dramatic that the Melungeons were portrayed as descendants of shipwrecked sailors, lost colonies, explorers, or forgotten populations who somehow made their way into the Appalachian Mountains. But here we have to slow down. A fascinating story is not automatically historical evidence, and physical appearance is not a reliable ancestry test. People have looked at old photographs of Melungeon families and tried to identify where they must have come from based on skin tone, hair, facial features, or eye color. But human appearance does not work like a geographic passport. Different populations can share physical traits, and different ancestries can produce similar appearances. So the question became, could genetics tell us what historical records could not? And this is where the story gets complicated. The first explanation is the cautious mainstream theory. Under this model, Melungeon communities developed primarily through the interaction of European, African American, and Native American populations in the southern Appalachian and Upper South regions. The important point is that there was probably not one founding population. There were multiple family lines, multiple migration routes, and multiple moments when different populations came together. The Tennessee Encyclopedia notes that later scholarly and genealogical research has largely upheld important parts of Price's interpretation. And this model explains something that the more exotic theories sometimes struggle with. Why do different Melungeon families appear to have different ancestral histories? Because they may actually have different ancestral histories. There may never have been one biological population called the Melungeons, in the way people imagine a tribe or isolated ethnic group. Instead, the name may have been applied to a collection of families and communities whose ancestry and social position overlapped. That is a much less dramatic explanation, but sometimes the less dramatic explanation is the one that fits the records best. Then came another piece of evidence. In 1969, William S. Pulitzer and W. H. Brown published a study examining demography, physical characteristics, and genetic markers among 177 people identified as Melungeons in Tennessee and Virginia. The study examined gene frequencies in 6 blood group systems and compared the results with populations from different parts of the world. Their interpretation suggested predominantly European ancestry with African American and possible Cherokee contributions, while also leaving open the possibility of a Portuguese component. But even this study could not answer one critical question. When did those different ancestral components enter the population? Were they brought together in America? Did some arrive through earlier colonial migrations? Did different families have completely different origins? Blood group research could identify patterns. It could not reconstruct an entire family tree. And that limitation becomes extremely important when we move into the modern DNA era. Imagine standing in eastern Tennessee 200 years ago. The mountains surround you. There are no DNA laboratories, no ancestry websites, no genetic databases comparing your chromosomes with populations around the world. You know your parents. You may know your grandparents. You may have heard stories about a great-grandparent. But beyond that, the details begin to disappear. A family moves, another family arrives, 2 people marry, a child is born, a census taker writes down a racial classification. Another census taker records the same family differently 20 years later. A family changes the way it describes itself. Another family stops talking about its ancestry completely. And generation by generation, the original story becomes harder to see. But something remains. Fragments of the past survive inside genealogy. They survive in old documents. They survive in surnames. And they can survive in DNA. This brings us to the second major theory, the Mediterranean and broader Old World connection. In 2010, Donald Yates and Elizabeth Hirschman published a study in the Appalachian journal titled Toward a Genetic Profile of Melungeons in Southern Appalachia. The study analyzed genetic information from a group of people who identified as having Melungeon ancestry. Unlike older blood group research, the study looked at DNA markers capable of revealing ancestry patterns across different branches of a person's genome. The researchers reported signals they interpreted as reflecting a mixture involving Mediterranean, Middle Eastern, North African, Sub-Saharan African, Native American, and Northern European populations. They also raised the possibility of South Asian or Roma ancestry among some founders. That sounds extraordinary, but this is where responsible storytelling matters. The study did not prove that every Melungeon descended from people from all of those regions. It did not prove that a group of Turkish sailors walked into Tennessee, and it certainly did not establish one single geographic homeland for every person who has ever been called Melungeon. The sample was small, and genetic matching to modern reference populations has limitations. A genetic similarity can suggest a connection. It cannot automatically tell you exactly when that ancestry entered a family. It cannot tell you which historical migration brought it there, and it cannot prove that an entire community shares the same ancestral mixture. Still, the study was important because it challenged the idea that the Melungeon story could be reduced to a simple European, African, and Native American formula. And this is where the third explanation becomes especially important. The African and Native American story, For years, some versions of the Melungeon mystery focused heavily on exotic ancestry: Portuguese, Turkish, Mediterranean, Middle Eastern. But African and indigenous ancestry are not side notes. They are central to the historical discussion. The historical record already contains evidence of mixed communities in the Upper South. Free people of color existed throughout colonial Virginia and North Carolina. Native American communities interacted with European settlers and African-descended populations, and people moved constantly through the frontier. The result was not a clean racial map. It was a network. A family could contain different ancestral backgrounds within only a few generations. And once those families moved into areas where communities were relatively isolated, those ancestral lines could become concentrated in particular places. This is where DNA can be incredibly powerful, but it can also be misunderstood. Mitochondrial DNA follows a direct maternal line. Your mitochondrial DNA comes through your mother, and hers came through her mother. Y chromosome DNA follows a direct paternal line in people who inherit a Y chromosome. But autosomal DNA is different. It reflects contributions from many different branches of your family tree. That makes it incredibly useful for understanding broader ancestry. But it also means that different descendants of the same historical family can inherit very different pieces of that ancestry. One sibling may receive a detectable segment from an ancestor that another sibling does not. Go back enough generations, and some ancestors may leave no identifiable DNA in a particular descendant at all. That is why the idea of one Melungeon DNA becomes misleading. The Melungeon Heritage Association explicitly states that there is no single Melungeon gene. Its guidance emphasizes that Melungeon families have different mixtures and that DNA testing by itself cannot establish Melungeon identity. Genealogy and historical documentation matter, and this may be one of the most important lessons in the entire mystery. DNA can tell you something about biological ancestry. It cannot tell you everything about identity. Your DNA cannot tell you what your great-great-grandmother called herself. It cannot tell you what language she spoke. It cannot tell you which traditions she passed to her children. And it cannot tell you how society treated her. Identity is historical. Identity is cultural. Identity is personal. And sometimes identity is shaped by surviving a world that wants to place you inside a box. Here's the twist that changes how you have to read the entire story. The Melungeons may not be mysterious because their origins are impossible to discover. They may be mysterious because there was never one origin to discover. Think about that. What if the reason every theory seems to explain part of the evidence is because every theory is looking at a different piece of the population? One family may have strong European ancestry. Another may have documented African ancestry. Another may have Native American ancestry. Another may carry ancestry that appears connected to populations around the Mediterranean or elsewhere. And these family lines may have become associated with one another through geography, marriage, community, and historical classification. Suddenly, the contradictions begin to make sense. The mystery is not necessarily one missing ancestor. It may be thousands of ordinary ancestors whose stories became tangled together over generations. And that changes the emotional meaning of the Melungeon story, because mixture is often described as if it represents loss. A pure identity disappeared. A population became fragmented. A culture became diluted. But what if we look at it differently? What if mixture is evidence of survival? Every migration represents movement. Every marriage represents connection. Every child represents another generation carrying something forward. A surname, a story, a physical trait, a genetic segment, a memory. And sometimes, even when the original story is forgotten, pieces of it remain. That is exactly why DNA has become so fascinating. It can reveal relationships that history forgot. It can challenge family traditions. It can confirm parts of a genealogy. And sometimes it can create entirely new questions. That is also the larger idea behind my book, The Bloodline Code: What Your DNA Reveals About Ancestry, Ancient Origins, Hidden Traits, and Human Evolution. The book explores the bigger questions behind stories like this one. What can DNA really tell us about our ancestors? How do ancient populations continue to influence people living today? What can genetic inheritance reveal about traits passed through families? And how does all of this connect to the larger story of human evolution? If the Melungeon mystery has taught us anything, it is that ancestry is rarely as simple as a percentage on an ancestry report. Your bloodline is a story, and sometimes the most interesting parts of that story are the parts nobody remembered. You can find the bloodline code through the link in the channel description and in the pinned comment. Because once you start looking at ancestry through the lens of DNA, the past stops looking like a straight line. It starts looking like a web. People moving, people meeting, people separating, people returning, populations mixing, and generations carrying pieces of those encounters into the future. The Melungeons were never simply what we thought they were. They were not necessarily one lost tribe. They were not simply one European population with a mysterious appearance. And they cannot be reduced to one DNA result. They represent something much more complicated. A population shaped by multiple ancestral streams, migration, intermarriage, social classification, and generations of adaptation. And perhaps that is why the story still matters. Because the Melungeons are not just a historical mystery, they are a reminder that human beings have always been more complicated than the categories created to describe them. We like clean borders, clean identities, clean beginnings, but human history is messy. It crosses oceans, it crosses mountains, it crosses racial boundaries, it crosses generations. And sometimes, the evidence of those crossings remains inside us. That leaves us with a much bigger question. If the history of one Appalachian population can become so complicated that generations of researchers are still debating its origins, how many other family histories around the world are carrying stories that have never been fully understood? How many ancestors disappeared from the written record but survived genetically? How many family traditions dismissed as myths contain a fragment of something real? And how much of the human story is still waiting inside the DNA of people who have never thought to look? The Melungeons were never simply what we thought they were, and perhaps neither are we. Because the deeper we look into our bloodlines, the more we discover that ancestry is not just about where we came from. It is about everything that happened between then and now.